So, to my immediate left is Jamal Joseph, who is a poet, filmmaker, and Oscar nominee who earned 2 college degrees while incarcerated for his participation in the Black Panther Party. He has appeared on Def Poetry Jam and American Gangster, among others. He's won a Cine Golden Eagle, a National Black Consortium Prize Pieces Award, a Black Filmmakers Hall of Fame Award, a Union Square Award, and a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship. And he also has a Best Song Oscar nomination for his work with impact on the film August Rush. Panther Baby, which is one of the things we'll be talking about today, holding up the book, is his first book. Next to Jamal is world-renowned poet, writer, playwright, and activist Sonia Sanchez. She's the author of more than 18 books, including Homegirls and Hand Grenades, Shake Loose My Skin, and Morning Haiku. She is a Poetry Society of America Frost Medalist and a recipient of the Langston Hughes Poetry Award. Does Your House Have Lions was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. At the end, Kathleen Cleaver has been in the forefront of the human rights movement for the greater part of her life. With her former late husband, Eldridge Cleaver, she founded the international section of the Black Panther Party in Algiers, Algeria. She is a graduate of Yale Law School, has practiced law, and is on the faculty of Emory University. She's the co-editor of Liberation, Imagination, and the Black Panther Party, the editor of Target Zero, A Life in Writing by Eldridge Cleaver, and she's continuing to work on her memoir, Memories of Love and War. So, you see we have some great literary and activist lights on our panel today. I'd like to start by asking the panelists if, for those of us who are too young to remember or getting too old to remember, what the mission of the original Black Panther Party was about, what the movement was about.
Well, I'm not going to answer that question directly. What I want to do is allow Jamal to flesh that out, because I was, as my friends referred to me when I came to California to be part of the Black Panther Party, well, Kathleen, you were old enough to be a leader. That meant I was 22, which is true.
Right.
The person who was saying that came at the age of 16. I think Jamal, 15?
15.
15. We had people come in at 13 because they had older brothers. Teenage girls and boys from high school, either high school dropouts or recently released from juvenile hall, or some were actually college students who would go to college and then be in the party. These were the backbone and the real force and the real energy of the Black Panther Party, who had so much energy and so much devotion, and it had short attention spans. They wanted a revolution now, immediately. And then we had to sort of rein them in and explain things and teach them and give them. So I just want to open it up to Jamal, one of those fierce, ready to roll young people. And how did you feel? What was a Panther? What were you coming to?
Yeah,
Yes.
Claudia had said that Panther Baby is the first book, but Sonia reminded me of this Look for Me in the Whirlwind, which was the collective autobiography of the Panther 21. And I think when they asked me to contribute some chapters, I was like 17. So I probably had like 10 pages because I didn't have much to write about. And then the bookend is Panther. And then in between there was a book about Tupac. And then the bookend now has kind of a full life to tell. But even so, as I was working on the book, and then very diligently and with a lot of help from my agent, Stephanie Abu, who's in the audience, it was important to look back, I think, and tell the story from the eyes of a 15-year-old in 1968 who was coming of age, not only in terms of his own pursuit of manhood, but in a time when America was very, very troubled and very, very violent, to set the context for what the Panthers were about. And so everyone, young people, were involved in talking about changing what was going on. And I came to the Panther Party from the civil rights movement. I had been a member of the NAACP Youth Council in my church. And when Dr. King, but we were seeing who we called that time the Black militants on television and at certain rallies talking about revolution and talking about Black power. And when Dr. King was killed, I went down to Harlem and participated in the fringes of the riot. And I came to school the next day and I announced to my friends who I would eat lunch with every day that I, at that time, Eddie Joseph, was going to be a Black militant. And one of my best friends, who was a white kid, a Jewish kid named Paul, said, Eddie, I don't know if you can announce that you're going to be a Black militant like it's a career choice. Like you're going to be a doctor or a lawyer. I was like, no, Paul, you watch. And so, as much to make good on my word, but to prove to Paul, not only did I have to be a Black militant, but I had to find the most militant organization. And literally, I saw a news report a day or two later about the Panthers storming the state capitol in Sacramento. They were doing a story on the Panthers, and a few months before, they had stormed the state capitol. And the news report was like, these are the craziest people in the world. And I'm watching the Panthers, and of course, that was in response to the Panthers Community Patrol, where Panthers would legally carry guns and law books and patrol the police, because in California, if the weapon wasn't concealed, you could carry a gun. And when the Panthers started patrolling the communities and policing the police, the legislature said, well, when we said citizens can carry guns, we didn't mean these militant Panthers in Northern California. So they moved to change the laws, and the Panthers responded by storming the state capitol in Sacramento. And I'm watching TV, and I'm seeing the Panthers storming, and I'm going, they are crazy. Look at they crazy. They got guns, they got leather coats, and then the news reporter said the militant Black Panther Party, and he said, and the police stopped one of their cars, and they found more guns and communist literature in the trunk of the car. And I said, they crazy. They got the leather coats, they got guns, they got communist literature. I want to join that one, because that was the most militant on the scene. So I came to the Panther office. We found the office that was in Brooklyn. Harlem office wasn't open yet. The Bronx office wasn't open. So we took this long train right out to Brooklyn, and I thought that, and this is what my older friends would tell me, that I would have to kill a white guy to prove that I could be a Panther. Because they said, the Panthers don't play. You're going to have to kill a white dude. And then my other friend said, no, get it straight. You don't have to kill a white dude. And because I was scared, I had to kill somebody. I was an honor student. I was in the choir. And so my other friend said, no, it's okay. You don't have to kill a white dude to be a Panther. And I said, oh, man, thank God, to myself, I don't have to kill anybody. He said, you got to kill a white cop. And you got to bring in his badge and his gun. So we're in the back. I'm sitting in the back row, and the person that was running the Panther meeting is explaining the Panther 10-point program, which was the basis of what we did. And it talks about housing and education and community control. And I jump up in the middle of it, and I said, choose me, brother. I want to be a Black Panther, and I'll kill a white dude right now. And he calls me up to the front of the room, and I'm standing on the side, and he lets me stand there for a second. I'm looking at all the Panthers and these cool brothers and sisters with their leather coats and their army fatigue jackets and the berets, and the older brothers and sisters, keep in mind I'm 15, but they were 18, 19, 20, but they were older to the 15-year-old. That's who was in the movement. And he reaches into the bottom drawer. My heart's pounding. I was like, look how far down he's reaching in that drawer. He's going to give me a big-ass gun. And he hands me a stack of books. And it was Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver, Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, the autobiography of Malcolm X, the famous little red book. We all had quotations from Chairman Mao. And I thought this must be a test. And I said, excuse me, brother, I thought you were going to arm me. And he said, excuse me, young brother, I just did. And the other thing that he made clear was that, he asked me, he said, look, you came in here talking about you want to kill a white dude. He said, let me ask you a question. If all of the police that are out there in the community, he said, these pigs that are brutalizing people, shooting them down, locking them up, he said, if they were Black and the people being victimized were white, all of these store owners that are ripping the community off with these high prices and with the spoiled vegetables and the rotten meat, if they were Black and the people being ripped off were white, he said, these jive-time fascist pig politicians, if all of them were Black and the people being exploited were white, would that make things correct? And I said, no, brother, it seems like it would still be wrong. And he said, that's right. This is class struggle for liberation, not just race struggle. So the two things that the Panthers really stood for that was made clear to this 15-year-old who came in thinking that he had to be bad and that he was going to get a gun was that this was going to be about work in the community, this 10-point program that talked about, as it summarized in point number 10, which was a demand for land, bread, housing, education, justice, and peace, that you had to work on the points in the 10-point program through service, and that there was this notion of this thing called class struggle, that there was a system called capitalism that was exploiting and oppressing people, and that most of our problems, if not out of our problems, were coming out of this condition of human greed versus human suffering, and the greed creating the suffering, the greed creating conditions in America from slavery on to what happened in the labor movement, to the oppression of women, of children. All of these things were articulated that first day, but in ways and in terms that you could really understand. And then the other thing that you understood about being a Panther was that right away you had to get out into the community and do something about it. You weren't going to be just a go-to-meeting Panther. You had to go to work in a breakfast program, and in the health clinics, and in tenant organizing, and in student organizing. And the goal was, a lot of people say, well, you talked about revolution, and you talked about overthrowing the government or changing the system, this redistribution of the wealth, which is a very socialist idea, and we admit that, and we knew that. But I remember the early on being a Panther, in our meetings, they were called political education classes. Someone saying something that really made me understand what it was to be not only a young revolutionary, but an organizer. And I still kind of work off this idea, this thing that I heard some 40 some odd years ago in a Panther office in Harlem. He said, the goal of the Black Panther Party is not to make every man, woman, and child in the black community a Panther. He said, we exist to teach our people the possibilities of struggle. And when they understand the possibility of struggle and the goal of liberation, the Panther Party will in fact become obsolete, because the community will be radicalized and revolutionized, and the next step organizations, the political organizations and the other organizations that will bring about revolution will come about. So that was clearly what it was. It was about understanding that it would be a life of service and probably sacrifice. Panthers were being arrested every day. Panthers were being killed almost monthly. You understood that, you embraced that, but you understood that you were doing this for the greater love of this thing that we call struggle and the greater love of the community.
Yeah, I'd like Kathleen and Sonia, I take it you were not a member of the party, but certainly an activist. Talk about, there's a sort of myth surrounding the Black Panther Party, a kind of violent romance, but what wasn't always noticed was things like the school lunch program, things like programs to help the community, and not just a lineup of, men the way Eldridge is in that, that photograph standing like this, that it was really about helping a community.
Well, I'd just like to deal briefly with a program that Bobby Seale conceived of. Every time we turned around, Bobby was getting arrested for something, and we'd bail him out, and then he'd get arrested another time. And so to deflect, in part, attention from the ways in which people were getting arrested, this is after the Panthers were stopped carrying weapons, and also to bring activism directly in line with needs that he felt. He had a 6-year-old son, and he would hear about the fact that in the schools children weren't learning, or there were claims that black children weren't learning. And he said, well, if they're going to school hungry, they're not going to be paying attention. So what we need to do is start a breakfast program. And we started the first one in Oakland in the St. Augustine's Church, which was an Episcopal church, and one in San Francisco, and a Catholic church. And this is very early on. And we called it Breakfast for Children. It served the needs of families who weren't feeding their children, or children whose families were too poor to give them healthy breakfasts, but it also engaged the Black Panther Party in social and community development in a way that was very helpful. The reason I'm telling you this is J. Edgar Hoover, who at the time was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, said the Black Panthers' Breakfast for Children is the most dangerous program that they have.
That's right.
So I'm trying to figure out, well, what was so dangerous about it? Looking back, there was more than 10,000 children a week being fed by Panthers across the country. Now think about that. We were teenagers or young adults. They were elementary school children. One of the most well-known was Chuck D, who became later Public Enemy. And there's all kinds of people who were in breakfast programs. But those children developed a whole different memory and a whole different take, not only on Black Panthers, but on themselves and their communities, than was the orthodox view. So maybe J. Edgar Hoover was onto something when he said it was dangerous.
Yeah.
Okay. What I was just remembering is that the first time I saw our brothers and sisters in leather jackets and berets, I went back to my days in junior high school in Harlem. The bad kids in our class, one who put us in closets because we were the good kids, right, actually wore in their gangs the black jackets and the berets. And when I saw them, I had a complete return to that. So I knew they were bad then on that level. I really did. And, you know, when we came to a place called San Francisco to begin Black Studies in the mid-1960s, we were approached immediately by the party to help woman and man the breakfast program. We were the teachers in there. We were the ones who got up and we actually made sure that the children got the food, and also we began to teach them. The third thing is because we were cultural artists, we also wrote for the paper. You know, we would go and anytime that there were any programs, culture programs, we were there with the poetry. We were there also to write the poetry in the newspaper. One of the things that we knew that we were about, that we were the cultural arm of the political part of, in quotes, the black revolutionary forces. So whenever something new came up, we were constantly reaffirming it. You know, so when the Panthers called the police pigs, you know, we would then use that terminology in our poems. In a long interview, someone coming out of Germany said, well, you know, I read this poem that I did. And I said, yeah, that's true, I did do that. And he said, so you're not doing that now? I said, well, yeah, right. I mean, hold it, people. You know, at some point you do understand that there are changes going on. And one of the things is that we were reflecting on purpose what was going on in the political arm of this thing called revolution in America. So the things that we did, when you listen to many of the rappers today, and that is why you truly do understand. When I first heard, and I'm not a revisionist, when I first heard some of the young rappers, I mean, I was like a lot of people, oh God, what are they saying? You know, they're speaking so fast and you can't understand them, right? But it reminded me when we went to a place called San Francisco, Barack and I got up on stage to read our poetry, and people did like, and then a hand went up and said, could you say that again? You know, and we looked at, we knew we were bad, you know, like, you know, he said something, I said something. He said something, I responded, like, and we did our New York stage kind of movement on the stage, right? And one of the young women said, yeah, but you said it so fast, we didn't understand you. And like all of a sudden, I looked up, and all of a sudden I remembered also my children saying, well, Mom, when we remember that we used to say to you when we were little, could you say that again, Mom? You said it too fast for us to understand. What we went out there was with this kind of really wild New York way of speaking, which was quite different. And aside, what the rappers have done in America is that they've made everybody in Kush, Iowa, someplace, understand fast speech, you know, fast things going on with this language. But what we did there is that we became the arm. You know, we were the people who came in and explained things poetically, or we did plays. Ed Bullens and Baraka and Marvin X and all of us would go on a Sunday morning, right? And we would blow the horns and ring the bells and to wake up people so they could hear our theater. You know, this agit-prop theater that we did. It was short, people, whatever. What we learned also going to Oakland, however, that one woman came up and said, it's too early. Come back. come back at 1 o'clock, right, or 2 o'clock. And we said, oh, got you. Because we were there like at 9:30, 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning to teach, to do this. But what we did is that the politics informed our poetry, and our poetry also informed, some of the young people, because many of them I began to teach poetry to. The young students. And I insisted, however, that what they do is that they learn the form. And I remember for a moment that there was a little problem going on, because they just wanted to say what they'd written. I said, no, but it takes revisions, At some point we got to rework this sucker, to get it right. And that was the joy of that, being a part of this great movement there. My first book, Homecoming, the brother Emery, who was the revolutionary artist, but he had a title. He was the Minister of Culture. He did my book because we worked together. And this is important. What people don't know is that we were doing something at the Point in Hunters Point, a big culture show. The night that our dear brother Huey was in trouble. What we had done as part of that cultural group is that we had managed, because of our, sense in the community, we had made available doctors and nurses available in case the party needed doctors and nurses. And that night, people had called me, but we stayed up at Hunters Point until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And by the time that the next morning that we got calls about our dear brother Huey had been left, at a hospital, someone said to me, Emery said, where were you? Where were you? Where were you? We were calling. We needed a doctor to take care of him. What we did were little things like that, but what we also did is that we made people understand that you cannot effect change without culture. Culture was also an arm, of this thing called change. That, when you began to talk about, the race and the class point, we would take it and put it in poems and in plays to inform people. Because we knew that when people came to see a play, be it 30 minutes or 45 minutes, they would walk out the way Brecht wanted people to do, walk out with that sense of what they had seen on stage, and they would put it into practice.
I think it seems what you're talking about is the word as revolution. I don't know if the pen is always mightier than the sword, but it's certainly as mighty. And through written word, you do reach people, you do make statements, you do change people.
Well, can I say, because you don't always realize what it is you're doing. I went out to San Francisco to teach, and I was involved, I said, with the Panther Party, but I was teaching at San Francisco State. We were starting something called Black Studies, and I was home one Wednesday, my off day, and my landlord was a Japanese American. He knocked on the door. He said, Professor Sanchez, there are 2 men here who want to talk to you. And this guy, before I could move, the guy reached in his pocket and had this badge that said FBI. Well, I lived 2 blocks from Haight-Ashbury, and there was always something going on in Haight-Ashbury. So I said to the guy, oh, is there a problem? Is there something going on? And he said, I can still see his face, you're teaching Du Bois. He didn't say Du Bois the way we said Du Bois. He said, you're teaching Du Bois, Hughes, Wright, Garvey. And, I'm not a revisionist again. I didn't truly understand what I was doing. You know what I'm saying? You do things because you know you must do it. And I said, when you're in a foreign country and you're trying to get people to understand, but you're speaking English and they're speaking, French, whatever, et cetera, right? I said, yes, I am teaching Black literature. Right? I teach Du Bois. And he turned to my landlord and said, put her out. Put her out of this house. She's one of those militants on campus. It was the first time I had been called a militant. I'm a teacher, I'm teaching. I'm talking about change, yes, but I am teaching, but I'm teaching well there. And I'm not doing anything in a classroom, but I'm teaching all kinds of people, in my class, you're going to teach Marx, but you're also going to teach, other poets who were in the world, so Neruda would be a part of that, and Guillen, all of this. And I said again to this guy, no, no, I'm teaching, whatever. And you realize he was angry. You know, my neighbor who raised Samoyeds, I don't know if you know that dog, most beautiful dog, and I come from New York, we could barely feed ourselves, much less a dog. And so I had looked at this dog, fed the dog, never petted the dog, whatever. And all of a sudden I heard these big feet come down the hallway. And I looked around, it was snow, and he sat right next to me and looked up at this man who had his hand in my face, and snow leaped for him. And he said, "Lady, call your dog." And I said, "Snow?" With a new appreciation of Snow, actually. And Snow sat down but never took his eyes. And then I said, "Well, I guess we're finished. I don't know what else to say to you. I'm teaching, whatever." They went out the door. But for the first time, I actually petted that dog. And he was in a house of vegetarians. I went out and bought him a steak, actually. But I went to campus, and I said to everyone there, I said, "Did the FBI come to your house?" Listen to this. They said no. And then I began to write in my journals. I said, "They came because I am teaching literature. I am talking about change and about life. That, I'm talking about people at some point understanding at some point. And I'm teaching also Langston and Du Bois, this man that they were angry because we had rescued Du Bois. We had rescued Langston, no one taught Garvey in the university, and we in our youth had rescued them, and we began to teach them. And when I was teaching at Amherst College, the door opened during the time I was teaching all males. Well, we had some students from Smith also, too. And Shirley Graham Du Bois came walking down the decline in this big lecture hall, and she came up on stage, and I said to my students, "Put down your pens. A great woman has entered into the hallways here at Amherst College." And one of my students raised his hand, "Oh, Professor Sanchez, is this going to be on our exam?" And I said, "Yes, that great exam called life." But she came on stage, and you don't always know what you're doing. And I stood there, and I gave her the lectern and the mic, and she turned to the student. She said, "You see this little woman here? You see how little she is?" But Shirley Graham Du Bois was little, too. And she said, "She rescued my husband from oblivion." And I started to cry, because in America, no one was reading Souls, of Black folk, and no one read as history majors Black Reconstruction, which was written in a Marxist style. So I actually crumbled, on that stage when she said that. But also I remember my father's voice too, who said, "Well, girl, you do realize you're in trouble here in America."
Jamal, I see you flipping through your book. Would you like to share what you're looking for?
I wanted to just talk about, as I'm doing that, and this idea of what you said, the word revolution, this idea of literature, this idea of art, and in that conversation of revolutionary struggle. In the Panther office, when you came in, if you can picture it, there were students, there were ex-convicts, there were street people, there were women, there were returning veterans. There were people who were disenfranchised, what we used to call the lumpen proletarian. And there were people who, because they were so disconnected and oppressed by society, were connected at the moment of hopelessness, realizing that by coming together and struggling, there could be hope and there could be life. And people shared their skills. You had to. So you had people who were laborers that were coming in, so you had women who learned how to be plumbers and how to be carpenters and how to fire weapons. And you had men that learned how to cook and how to change diapers and how to heal when we had the medical cadre. And the common thread was that everyone studied. And now you have to picture people who might be coming out of prison or might even be coming home from the military who could not read or who could barely read. And then you have to picture students who were coming in who were college students, second, third year, some college graduates, understanding that their part in the struggle was to learn from that person, but also to teach them how to read. So one of the greatest steps of liberation, and why this very gathering would be illegal in this country not so long ago, keep in mind that there were codes that say that for the three of us sitting here who can actually read and write, and all of us who are college professors, Sonia Sanchez is Professor Emeritus at Temple University and taught at many other universities. Kathleen is on faculty at Yale and Emory. I'm a full professor at Columbia University. That this would be a crime, that we as slaves would have been beaten, tortured, maybe killed, and that the white people in this room for cavorting with us, for talking about literature, for showing that, would be fined and thrown into prison. And there's a reason why oppressed people should not be able to read, because one of the most revolutionary things that you can do, and that's why I was given a book instead of a gun that first day, is to teach an illiterate mind how to be literate, and to teach that literate mind what the real meaning of the word liberation is. And so that's why what Penn's work in prison is so powerful, and that's why when I talk about that journey, and I'll find that passage a little bit later in the book, when we started to organize prisoners, that first you had to kind of stand your ground and people understand that, yeah, you were a Panther and you could fight and you could be rough and tough, but that they saw you in action not against other prisoners but against the guards. And sometimes you stood up for people that didn't even like you, that would cuss you out, that didn't understand what you were doing when you tried to pass them a book at first. But then when the guard would try to come in their cell and tear up their personal property and they pushed the guard out, it were Panthers in prison that were there fighting with someone that had just previously said, I'm not interested in that revolutionary shit. I just want to do my time. And then it was Panthers that fought for them to get their business, and Panthers who organized these hunger strikes. And our very next act was to sit down and said, let's read this book together. Because here's the thing. You can listen to anybody tell you anything, but when you can read it and begin to analyze it for yourself, your path to manhood, your path to liberation, your path to womanhood is clear. And that's the real power of it, and that's why in the center of all of these conversations, they're all about struggle. It does come down to teaching a people to be literate, but to be literate in what liberation is really about.
I'd like to comment a little bit, go back to what you mentioned. You said 10-point platform and program, which is very standard, the key element of the Black Panther Party. What's so intriguing to me is that people will tell you everything about that they know about the Panthers, because I ask questions, I give a lot of talks. What do they know? Oh, they were violent. Oh, or they wanted to kill people, or they were criminals. The 10-point, the first thing they ought to know is a 10-point platform and program, which the first point was, we want power to determine the destiny of our own black community. And then it goes on and talks about housing and education and criminal justice. And the final point was we wanted to have a plebiscite. We didn't take a position. The Black Panthers didn't take any position on these issues of that era, which seems so quaint now, of separatism or integration. No one talks about integration, and no one talks about separatism anymore. But these were the raging controversies. So our position was that there should be a plebiscite. Blacks should be able to just say, have a vote supervised by the United Nations, and then we could find out. And back to this business of being separatists, not being for integration, we were in the frame of the Black Power movement that evolved from the community upheavals that came out of the Southern civil rights or freedom struggle, and in particular, insofar as the Student Nonviolent Coordinator, SNCC, focused in on black political power, creating political parties, and going to the polls and choosing leaders who represented the issues that were totally overlooked or suppressed by white racist political power. This is where this movement originated and saw the revolutionary potential. But what's so intriguing to me is found a way to communicate to high school kids, to ex-convicts, to housewives, to ordinary people what revolutionary change entailed and that they could do it. We gave voice to people who never even thought and this is in the 60s when the issue of voting wasn't all that clear. And so we took images from revolutionaries in the Congo or in Cuba or in Algeria. We took names from people in Africa. We read about Fanon. We were sort of eclectic but determined and really, really committed to revolutionary transformation because we knew it could happen.
Yeah.
We'd seen it happen. We could see it in Vietnam. We could see it in Cuba. We could see it in Algeria. We could see it. So what we couldn't see is why we couldn't get it ourselves.
Well, we
couldn't see that part.
Yeah.
So we refused to see that, and we were gung-ho activists believing, and this is, I think, very key to the way we were able to connect, believing that our most important weapon was imagination. So we did a lot with music, with theater. We didn't have much more than imagination.
Yeah, music, theater, the paper which Eldridge
Right,
found
the
because he understood
newspaper.
how important that was.
And so we had a creative message, and we inspired young people to join us and be very creative. Now you can see that this would present the government with a tremendous problem that they decided to corrupt. That was their decision. They first decided to just squash it, destroy it, shoot a few people.
Right.
But only that made it bigger,
Yeah.
made it more important,
That's
you know.
right.
And so then the effort was to corrupt it from within.
And there was that cool factor. This is the passage I found because this is me as a 15-year-old and my first encounter with the Panthers. So for all the ideology that we talked about in the community service and all that, the Panthers were pretty cool. And I'll read this passage. This is the night that Dr. King was killed. I walked into the Panther office in Brooklyn of September of 1968. Dr. King had been assassinated in April of that year. Riots and anger flared in ghettos around the country. The feeling on the street was that the shit was about to hit the fan. Black power was the phrase of the day, and hating Whitey was the hip and cool thing to do. From street corner speeches to campus rallies, Whitey had gone from being the man to being the beast. Young black students were trading in their feel-good Motown records for the recorded speeches of Malcolm X and the angry jazz recordings of Ornette Coleman. I went down to 125th Street in Harlem the night that Dr. King was assassinated. Protesters and rioters swarmed the streets, clashing with cops, overturning cars, setting trash can fires and hurling bricks at white-owned businesses. One of the storefront windows was shattered by an airborne trash can. Looters ran into the store and started taking clothes, appliances, and whatever else they could carry. Not everyone looted. In fact, most of the crowd continued to chant, "The King is dead," and "Black Power." But it was enough for the cops to start swinging clubs, shooting their pistols, and making arrests. A cop grabbed me and threw me against the wall. Before he could handcuff me and put me in the paddy wagon, a group of rioters across the street turned a police car over. The cop told me to stay put and ran toward the rioters. I was scared, but I wasn't stupid. I took off running in the opposite direction. I blended in with the group of rioters and tried to figure out which way to go. A group of cops headed toward us. Some of the rioters ran into a clothing store that was being looted. I followed. The cops entered the store swinging clubs and making arrests. My heart pounded as I ran into the back of the store and found a back door leading to an alley. I gasped for air as I ran down the alley and was stopped by a wooden fence. The cops came into the alley. "Halt," they yelled. "Put your hands up." In my mind, I froze, put my hands in the air, and turned around to face the cops with tears in my eyes. But my body kept hauling ass. I grabbed the fence, scurried over the top like a scared alley cat. 2 shots rang out. One splintered the wood on the fence near my butt. This gave me the fear, adrenaline push I needed to flip over the fence, pick myself up off the ground, and scramble out of the alley. When I turned out on the street, I kept running right past 2 other cops who tried to grab me, but I jerked away. Turning the corner, I almost collided with a group of 20 or so black men in leather coats and army fatigue jackets, standing on the corner, afros and berets in military-like formation. "Stop running, young brother," one of the men with a beard and tinted glasses said. "Don't give these pigs an excuse to gun you down." I doubled over, heaving, trying to catch my breath. I didn't know this man, but his voice sounded like a raft of confidence in a sea of chaos. Moments later, 2 cops ran around the corner. They stopped in their tracks when they saw the militant men. The ranks closed around me. "What are you doing here?" one of the cops demanded. "Move aside." The black man with tinted glasses didn't flinch. "We're exercising our constitutional rights to free assembly, making sure no innocent people get killed out here tonight." "We're chasing looters," the cops retorted. "No looters here. As you can see, We're a disciplined community patrol. You have guns? The cop asked, a tinge of fear in his voice. That's what you said, the man with tinted glasses replied. I said, we're exercising our constitutional rights. The cops took in the size and the discipline of the group for a moment and walked away. By this time, I'd caught my breath, but I was speechless from what I had just seen. Black men standing down white cops. Go straight home, young brother, the man with tinted glasses said. The pigs are looking for any excuse to murder black folks tonight. With that, the black men walked on. I scooted down the subway and rode home. When I entered the apartment, Noonie, Grandma, was sitting on the couch watching images of Dr. King on the TV. Tears fell from her eyes. She didn't even ask me where I had been, which was unusual since I was about 2 hours late getting home. I sat next to her, put my arm around her, and we watched the TV reports of the assassination and the riots.
Thank you for that. Well, one of the things you mentioned before was, did you mention, Jamal, I think that greed being what has given rise to so many problems. Greed on one end. What was the other word you used?
Greed and suffering.
Greed and suffering. And in some ways, that continues. When you said that, I kept thinking about banks and mortgage companies and people squeezing people literally to death. In the time we live now, people unable to eat, people unable to support their children, people made homeless through no fault of their own by the greed of big corporations and big banks and in some ways big government. Can you all speak to, where is activism now? Everybody seems so thoroughly depressed and beaten down by all of this.
Thoroughly depressed. The reason I said, wait a minute, I just remember seeing the May Day demonstrations that were captured on television, only two. But the two that I saw, one was New York and the other one was Oakland. I couldn't really tell the difference because it was all a fight scene. Police, activists. I said, wow, that reminds me of '68. It was like the energy of like, okay, we're through. We do not respect what you're doing. We have an alternative understanding of what is correct, what is proper, what is appropriate, and that's why they're being beaten up. That's what I saw. And I saw it in Oakland, and I was just very pleased to know that the area of Oakland where there were a lot of Black Panthers, and now there's a lot of children of Black Panthers and grandchildren of Black Panthers or radicals, they're taking this Occupy movement on a different level than
like
in
the
many
Occupy
other places.
Wall
So
Street
I'm not going to say the country is in great shape, and we all are, we're not going to have any more kumbaya moments, I don't think. But I will say that there is a cadre of young people who have sort of had enough. They've had enough. They say, well, look, you just have to change this. What I see, now I'm a lot older, but I see Occupy very analogous to sit-ins. It's like, we're just going to come here and tell you we don't want this law. We're not going to take you to court. We do not want this law. We want change. We want change, and we want it now. Now, it's a lot different to get served in a restaurant than to get a bank to change its policies, but the impulse is analogous. And so I don't think we should be so, what did you say, demoralized?
I didn't, but demoralize is a good word.
Yeah.
that we can find reason to hope.
Yeah.
That's what I was saying.
Yeah. I think, like, as within any fight, when you get punched a lot, you get numb. But also, so I think that for a lot of poor folks and working poor, that they are numb. But there is this energy. I've been across the country on a book tour. I've been to 9 cities, and people that would come out would be a mix of students, young activists, older people who had been in the movement, and the conversation would be about just that. It would be about what was going on, and the thing that I'm a little sad about is that for all the social media and connectivity, that people are not connecting more in terms of understanding just how big the movement is, and that people in the room. We used to, like, something would happen in a city. The cops would shoot someone or someone would be brutalized. And Columbia University would blow up and San Francisco State would blow up. And we get that word out just with phone calls and with flyers. It was like that movement net before the internet. So what people have to do and what Occupy movements and other things are doing is use social media to get people out on the street, because it's those strength in numbers. And then once people are out in the street, in the meeting halls, what we would do afterwards, or like when a university would be shut down or a neighborhood would be shut down, is that afterwards people would gather in dorm rooms or in someone's houses. They would cook a big meal to try to feed everybody. And then people from different aspects of the movement would talk to each other. So Panthers would be talking to folks from the women's movement and from the workers' movement and from the Latino and the Asian movements, and then you would take what you had learned back to your communities. So people would go back to the white community, they would go back to the anti-war movement, and they would be talking about police brutality, and they would be talking about discrimination, housing, and we would come back and be talking about those issues, and you understood that you were part of one struggle. The other thing that's very, very key, and then I've been saying to the Occupy people across the country, is that people in the community can't just know you from seeing you on TV. It can't be just another news item. What the Panthers did and what made people relate to it, we were talking about that on the way up here, how some people would say, oh, the Panthers fed me. I was cool with the Panthers. Panthers were in the community feeding folks, those health clinics. Sometimes we set up separate spaces. Sometimes it was a Panther office on a Saturday where you get medical professionals on their day off to come with their medical kits, to come with medicine and treat people for high blood pressure and for sickle cell anemia and for other things that were going on. And so people in the community, and the Panther office would become that community crisis center. So if somebody was sick, and somebody was upstairs not breathing, instead of calling an ambulance that probably wasn't going to get there for an hour, if it came at all, they'd run into the Panther office. My grandmother's not breathing. If two people were fighting on the street corner, two guys were around the corner fighting, they wouldn't call the cops, knowing the cops were just going to come arrest these guys, if not shoot these guys. They'd run into the Panther office. Two guys are out there fighting with knives, knowing the Panthers were out there to try to resolve that. So for people who are community organizers or people who are activists, the community has to be part of that. And you have to involve the community and organize people around their needs. Go back to the breakfast program example. Right? We understood that you can't take a first grader and teach them arithmetic by saying 3 apples plus 2 apples equal 5 apples, and their stomach is growling. And so on a real basic level, when you said, I'm representing the poor, the people that are disenfranchised, that sounds good, but to a homeless person or a family that's almost homeless, what is freedom? Freedom is a meal if you're hungry. Liberation is a roof over your head and a safe, warm, dry place to sleep if you're homeless. So that part of the movement has to kick back in and organize people. And finally, I'll just say, Bobby has this great thing that he says that when he and Huey started the Black Panther Party, that they patrolled the streets with shotguns and law books because those were the dynamic weapons of social change. The guns were there to say that we will defend ourselves, defend the community, we have a constitutional right. The law books were there, they knew the law by heart, but to physically represent that we understand the law, we're going to advise this person of their rights, follow them, bail them out if we can. If not, we have people standing by to raise the money. But he said that if Huey knew, and he said this a few years ago to show you how forward-thinking Bobby remains, that if he and Huey were organizing the Panther Party today, Panthers would still be in the community, they'd still be patrolling the streets, but they'd be out there with video cameras and laptop computers, because these are the dynamic weapons of social change. But believe this, they wouldn't just be out there documenting and blogging. They'd find a way to use those tools to do active revolutionary community organizing, and most importantly, to get folks in the community involved in those programs to understand something I said in the beginning, the possibility of struggle, the possibility of change, the possibility of freedom.
But there, in a sense, you knew that this group had your back. And I think that's different than what's happening now. Yes, you can go occupy Wall Street, you can occupy the park.
That has been doing a cop watch program to deal with this incredible problem that we have here in New York, this stop and frisk. You know, last year there were close to 800,000 people who were stopped and frisked, and of that number, 2/3 of them were young black men. Only about 6% led to an arrest. We have this other thing right up in Harlem at this very moment. There's a rally and there's a teach-in about mass incarceration. When I was in prison, I spent a total of 9.5 years in prison. The United States was number 3 in the amount of people that it had incarcerated. About 400,000, 500,000 people were locked up, third behind the then Soviet Union and South Africa. Now, undisputedly, number 1.
We're number 1.
With 2 million plus people. So as that prison military industrial complex begins to grow, and there's profitability in that. When you're in prison, you have to work or you go to the hole. And we're beyond like making license plates. In Leavenworth, when I was there, they were making uniforms for the military. They were making furniture that were sold to the government agencies. Now people are making fiber optic cables, and they're paying people the grandson of 50 cents an hour, 75 cents an hour. And I know brothers, once they had started to get it up to $1 an hour, they'd be in the yard like, I'm getting paid. I'm making $1 an hour now. So we see that this is legalized slavery. So on all fronts, those kind of organizations. But what would happen? And so there's the Malcolm X Grassroots Collective. I run an organization called Impact Repertory Theater, and we call it a creative arts and leadership training organization, where the kids go out and they do community service, where they're creating progressive art, but where they come together literally to watch each other's back as they're going out into the community and doing things. And then when that happens, see, you have to picture this is what would happen in the Panther office. If the police came to raid a Panther office, then you knew that the Panthers would stand up and that however many people in the office had your back. But that might be 5 people, that might be 10 people, because Panthers were out in the community organizing. What stopped a lot of Panthers from dying, and even more Panther officers from being raided and people being killed, was that the community would see the police out there, and hundreds and thousands of people would come out to watch what was going on. Hundreds of people would stand between the police and the Panthers just to say, no, you're not going in there. We're going to wait till the press gets here. We're going to wait till some lawyers get here. And, of course, J. Edgar Hoover and the ideology of the FBI and counterintelligence program, but they're terrorists, but they're revolutionaries. And that's when you would get grandmothers says, they may be all that, but they're feeding my grandkids. They may be all that, but that's where I go to get my medicine because the hospital ain't doing anything. They may do all that, but when I was about to be evicted, they stopped the marshals from coming in and showed us how to take over this building and fix it up. So it really does come back to community, right, because ultimately that's who really has your back, and you need those numbers to make change in a community and in this society.
Yes. Do you want to say something, Sonia?
What'd you say? Yeah, I was scribbling. A couple things in response. When one saw the 10-point program that the Panthers had, we also had seen the 10-point program of the nation, and what Malcolm had done with Muhammad Speaks. And so we understood the connectedness. When our dear sister Kathleen talked about one of the things about SNCC, when one began the Black Studies program at a place called San Francisco State, we turned and called members of SNCC who came out west to help populate the Black Studies program. And no one has really talked about that connection of SNCC and Black Studies and SNCC and the people, in this movement, this cultural movement. I remember just recently meeting a couple of years ago, what we used to do in New York City, we would come into a supermarket where we lived, and I don't know if you ever, I'm a veggie, I'm like a vegan, actually a microbiotic. I don't get involved with it that much, but I don't eat meat, but I go into the supermarket, and there the meat had been jabbed full of red dye in Black communities and to make it look healthy. And you knew it was unhealthy, so you would take the meat and put it in the carts, and then you go over to where the veggies and the fruit, where they were, just sitting there like they had a nervous breakdown, and that's how terrible it was, and you put it in the cart, and then you push you would push the button, and the guy come and say, yell, yell. You say, how dare you bring this up to our neighborhoods, and you charge us first-class prices for this stuff. And said, lady, I'm going to call the police. You say, yeah, do that. We need a discussion with the police about what's going on here. And I did this, about 3 years ago again. I consciously, like many people who were in movements, moved to neighborhoods that they thought were depressed neighborhoods. I live in Germantown. I remember when I came there to teach, the people who were going to get a place for me took me to housing right around UPenn. They took me to Chestnut Hill. And the woman said to me in Chestnut Hill, and this is more than 30 years ago, said out loud, oh, Professor Sanchez, you're going to integrate this area. And I said, but I did that, in New York City, in Riverside Drive, right, and in the Village. So I want to live in a neighborhood where there are people who look like me, but people who don't look like me, and older people and people who really need examples. I mean, I said that, and the woman said to me, I can still hear her say, I don't do housing like that. She said, I have to call someone who perhaps will do the housing, that kind of housing. And it showed me a house in Germantown. I remember, but at least 3 years ago, doing the same, going into my supermarket there, and here it has started again because they've been taken over by new people. And I took the stuff out again, and I pushed the button. The guy came out, and I said, what's the deal here? I said, look at this stuff. But I also saw out of the corner of my eye this woman standing there with 3 children. And so the guy said, lady, I said, we need good fruit, good vegetable. And I said, I prefer not to have meat, but good meat, if there's such a thing as good meat, right? But not shot full of this red dye. And I said, call the police. I said, and he said, lady, but this woman said to me, I'm getting ready to go. She said, how do you do that? And I looked at her, I said, excuse me, what did you say? She said, how do you do that? And I'm looking at her and these 3 children. I said, are you asking me, how do I pick up this stuff and put it in here and it's not good? And it's not good. She says, yes, I know it's not good, but how do you do that? And the question that she was asking was the question that we attempted to answer in the 60s and 70s and 80s, is that, is through education, that you teach people that you cannot let people, oppress you, with the food, with the housing that one sees and still happening in New York City also. So I stood there and said, well, I was blessed to be educated. And I said, but when I became educated, I knew I can't think of the brother's name, the lawyer who moved to Ohio here and was fired from his job, the white lawyer and his wife, who now still live in Ohio, that you go and you move in an area so therefore people can look up and learn for how you live, how you teach, what you do. Learn from the basketball hoop that I put in the backyard of my house, where the children came from the projects to play with my children, and the children also who lived on that block, whose parents taught at UPenn and Temple, But I also know that it marks you, and I say this out loud, that you're marked.
Yeah.
And I know your children are marked because they will look up and say, oh yeah, you're the children of that poet, who has this place where all these children come in, and you also have, give books to the children and say, when you read it, come and talk about it. Your children are marked. They don't become a part of that middle class thing, where people look out for you, and make sure that your child gets this and that, whatever. Your children are then put on a level, by themselves, that you're out there to protect them. And perhaps there are other people who don't protect them. But this is, what you do. What you do simply is that you cannot read this stuff. You cannot go around the world and not where you live, not employ also the things that you've learned, that you've got to at some point understand that the necessity of saying simply that I can have a nice house in this community. And my point is that for you to have a nice house in this community also too. This is what we're after. We're after, all of us living, well at some point and living in a humane fashion. That's what this has all been about in my life also too. But there have been consequences as a consequence of it all. Yeah.
Yes. And many of those children don't even make it that far, as we know from the prison writing program, because, the majority, obviously, of people in prisons in the U.S. is Black and Hispanic.
Right.
But I
want to say, because I taught at Gradyford Prison for 5 years. And we did this because there was a woman in Philadelphia when we had, at Temple University, Mrs. Hyman, who came, and she was a very wonderful woman. She just made transition last year. And she knocked on my door at Temple, and she says, "Oh, Professor Sanchez, it's so good. I heard you speak the other day." And she said, "We want you to teach in the evening for our program here at Temple University, where we teach courses, and people come and take these courses for free." And, you're overworked, and the first instinct, oh, God, something else I got to do, right? But you looked at her and you realized, so you did that. And then there was a summary of the first year. And I said with my big mouth, this is really great because community people are getting an education, right? We're teaching them. And I said, we should go into the prisons. And then Ms. Hyman said, without missing a beat, then you should go take that program into the prisons. And I did that for 5 years. And what I learned, when the brothers started to write there, what I learned is that I said, when that cell door closed and I went walking down that tier and the brothers had all gathered, and brothers, black, whites, Latinos there in that classroom of about 50 to 60 men. I said, when you get out of prison, you can come to Temple. I'll make sure you take courses. And the whole class fell out laughing. And I said, what? They said, most of them are lifers. And they had come out of Vietnam.
Right.
And I did not, until I taught that class, have the connection of you went to Vietnam, you got hooked on drugs, you were taught how to kill, you came home, that was what you did, and you ended up at a place called Gradyford Prison, whatever. But you also ended up being there with them for 5 years until they put you out for like a fluke. Because what we were doing at that particular time is that, you were teaching brothers how not to exploit each other. I mean, you did the lit, right, but there was always something with the lit at the same time, the discussions, and they were harsh discussions, and there were always guards in there listening at some point. So I come back to teach my course beginning the 6th year, and boom, the men that the guards that I had established a relationship with said, "Professor Sanchez, they're not letting you in. They said that you are teaching I almost caused a riot when I did a poetry reading there. And I didn't. It's just that when I began to chat at some point, the brothers started to beat the drum or on the, whatever, et cetera. And then they stood up and we chanted together. And I was reported I had always causing a riot. So they push you out. But also at the same time, luckily enough, in that same program, there were people who would come in with me, and we had people who were trained who came in and continued doing that work, in their own way. That is important, that kind of continuation, because one of the things we forgot, and you mustn't forget, with this movement here that's going on now, is that culture is the consciousness of a people. That's why they put nonsense on the idiot box now. That's what it is, the idiot box, and they tell people the only way you'll become, viable is that if you win $1 million, whatever, and so therefore we have people then looking at, trying to win $1 million because they can dance well, how fast do we have to dance to become slow in America, huh? Whatever, and this is what we understand at some particular point. And so always, this thing, this culture, this important thing that people will usurp the culture and begin to give the kind of culture for people, to look at, which will not talk about anything, other than you can become a millionaire too if you go on the idiot box, whatever, and say the following or dance in this way. That we know. And the point is, how then do we begin to, to make things happen in a different kind of way? I went in and talked to some of the young people who were, sitting in, there, and they didn't know names of people. I knew why they were there, I know that this is the beginning of something, but they didn't know names of people, who had struggled, who had done the kind of sit-ins also in the past. And what we do know at some point is that what we've got to keep this continuity going, that we've got to make people understand that when you go in to do work, there's a trail behind of people who've done it before. It's like when we started to write poetry, we thought, oh, we're so bloody bad, you know what I mean? Whatever. No one's done this before. And then I heard Gwendolyn Brooks and Margaret Walker, right? I heard Sterling Brown, right? And you understand, whoa, yeah. It has not only been done before, but also we are that continuity. We are the continuation of what has come before us. Yeah.
I think that although I hate to stop these.
Just one point.
Oh, yeah, no, please.
Because
this is
And I
his
guess
book.
I can't stop them either.
no, this is such an important issue, though, that you
No,
talked about in terms of the legacy of incarceration. I think
Right.
Right. Just for a minute, it is so frightening in terms of those numbers, and in terms of the prison system of that $2 million number, these prisons being filled with black and brown boys. There are numbers that say 1 in 3. Well, first of all, look at it in this context. 1 in 4 black and brown student young men might graduate from high school. That's what the numbers are. 1 in 3 are guaranteed to go to prison or to have an encounter with the criminal justice system. And I think in Harlem, where I live, my good friend Daniel Beatty, who's a phenomenal actor and activist, says that number is 1 in 2. I do know this to be true, that in New York State, that 75% of the young men who are in prison today come from 5 zip codes.
Yeah.
5 zip codes. 2 of those zip codes are in Harlem. 1 is in Brooklyn, 1 is in Queens, 1 is in the Bronx. Poor communities, black and brown boys. That is the number that we're dealing with in the crisis. And the kids in my neighborhood have slogans like 25 to life, meaning that they are convinced that they will be dead or doing life by the time that they're 25 years old. So they accept this
Yes.
kind of as their destiny. And then you have kids now, again, in the community. I have a son who's in graduate school at Columbia University who wrote something for a fellowship application the other day, and he talked about the fact that on our block and even in our building, that a lot of the kids that he grew up with, that they're dead or in jail. So I started to kind of reverse, because, proud of the fact that he graduated college and that he, that he goes to Columbia, and I could not count except 1 or 2 other kids on that block and our stuff that had made it to college, but a whole lot of them that had made it to jail, and 2 of them that I know died. 1 got killed right in the block. So this is a real crisis. And what I want to say that we have to do, if folks are moved by this work, then there is that mentorship in the prison. That's real important. And by the way, these programs, I was smiling when you talked about that, because I remember professors that would come in to teach when I was in prison. And we had a woman who, a professor who was had to be in her late 60s, early 70s, Professor Johnson, that came in, who was an English teacher, and she'd mark your papers up, and she was a petite woman, and she'd mark your papers up, and I know you could do better than this. And I'm talking about guys who were doing life, who were like 250 pounds from the weight, and they take the papers back. I know you could do better, and they'd be afraid. And then one day, this really sealed the deal. She came in with the Holy Bible, the King James Version, and had redlined and found grammatical errors. And we're in the back like, man, Professor, she done redline the Bible, man. She got God on lockdown with this English stuff. What are we supposed to do? And there was one guy named Big Bo who was doing life. And Big Bo was like 250 pounds of pure muscle, could knock you out with either hand. And he's standing in the yard real depressed one day. We're like, Bo, you all right? He was like, Mom, I'm all right, man. Bo, what's wrong, man? Your mom okay? We knew his mother was a little sick. Yeah, mom was cool. What happened, man? You went to the parole board? They hit you again? No, man, it's not the parole board. Well, what is it, Bo? Man, Professor Johnson gave me a C, man. That's my whole grade point average. People want to learn. They care about that concerned love, that tough love. Sadly, that program is cut. Sadly, as that number has jumped from, as I said, from 500,000 to 2 million in the 25 years or so that I've been out of prison, that those programs have been cut. Now, we know that it's cheaper to send someone to Yale than it is to keep them in jail, right? To send someone to get a top-tier education at a great state school or a place like Stanford or Columbia University is about, $55,000 a year. It's $100,000 to keep somebody in prison. It's counterintuitive the way we do it. But my last word on this is that we need the mentorship in prisons, but also what we need is in the communities. So for college students, for the volunteers, for fundraisers, where these aggressive programs where we're giving people reading skills, life skills, making sure that they eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner, all of those things to combine that cancer, right, of poverty and lack of education, that is a frontline crisis kind of work that we have to be doing right now. There are companies that do studies that test third-grade reading scores in poor communities to determine, brothers and sisters, not how many schools to build, but how many prisons to build. What can turn that around, what will turn that around, the only thing that would turn that around is us. We can't depend on the government to do it. Washington, we know, is broken all kinds of different ways. Our state government, local government is broken all kinds of different ways. It's that activism, and it's a group of people who care about environmental justice, the same way we care about global warming and all those things that we should care about, to say, you know what? These children are our greatest natural resource. Let's get active and serious and militant about that.
And by the way, our mentorship program at Penn is not supported by our government. It's supported by donations from people like you and donations by individuals who can afford it and who really care. So our program will not be being cut. I'd like to thank the panelists. What a lively and wonderful discussion from the head and the heart. But I'd like to open it up to the audience. Do you have questions, comments, anything you'd like to address to the panelists? You have to have some questions. You can't have heard this and not have something to ask. Anybody?
Yes,
Nobody?
there's someone right there.
I'll give you my.
Could you stand up so we could see you?
Excuse me. Hi, I'm glad to be here. So I had a question just on the mass incarceration.
What's your name?
Oh, hi, ma'am. Carla Murphy.
You have to do that. Yeah, I just told you, we have 3 professors up here. You have to stand up, say your name.
Make me feel like I'm back in school. All right. And I wanted to ask, on mass incarceration and stop and frisk in the city, we're getting started with an election year here. Well, Obama's about to kick off his campaign. And the 2013 mayoral election is coming up. And mass incarceration nor stop and frisk, these are not talking points yet. And I wanted your explanation as to why it's not.
Why it's not on the agenda?
Yeah, why is it not on the agenda?
It's not a popular thing. It's a real hard subject to take on, because then you have to get back to this conversation of class and race, because it's a class thing as much as a race thing in terms of why you want to eliminate that segment, that can be a real kind of force for change and all of that. And so, you can't out and out, do things that overtly seem like genocide because the eyes of the world are on you, but you can do genocide through neglect, and it brings up those issues. And the other thing about politics is that most politicians are careerists. They're interested in getting elected, not doing the right thing. So the challenge has to come on a real local level for people to be motivated to do things because they see the light, but because they feel the heat. You see? So that's not on the agenda. The living wage thing was such a hard struggle for people to do. And then we have a mayor that just says for the living wage bill that there's no doubt that he'll veto that when it comes. So it's the interest. When you look at who's funding campaigns, and when you look at those businesses, when you start to kind of do your due diligence and trace down the tentacles of the investments and the companies who are doing business with those companies that have interest in the prison industrial complex, it gets pretty scary. So again, it's grassroots movements, it's creating that kind of pressure, it's people taking it to the streets, it's people doing programs that don't depend on government support to organize and to do things. And it's then the Panthers started putting local politicians into office, running people for office. And it's getting these people who are not bought, who are not paid for, who don't have to answer to any of these special interests to create a new paradigm that might be a shift that we don't see in 2012 or 2013, but we'll see down the line. How many bright young people who are in law school or business school do you hear ever talking about going into politics these days? It's corrupt. They don't want to deal with it. They either go in saying, I'm going to go in and do this career, or I'm going to go someplace and do complete community work, but they know that the system is broken. And I think it takes that kind of mass action on several levels. You have to do policy, you have to do community organizing, you have to do grassroots programs.
The other issue is that, and Jamal touched on it, prisons are a big business in this country. And there are whole cities and towns completely supported by the huge prison in that city and town. And if we get rid of those prisons, which is, for those of us who wish this with all our hearts, these are cities and towns that can no longer exist unless they get another form of business. So it's not really in their best interests to address that issue. At least their best interests as they see it.
Hi, thank you very much. I came here thinking about your interactions in the past with the Young Lords and AIM and wondering about that. And right now what I'm thinking about is listening to Jamal talk. It sounds as though you were reading anarchist literature as a young Panther, not Mao. Any comments on any of that?
No, it was definitely, we definitely, when we talked about our kind of organizing, our kind of socialism, that it had to be something that we would learn. As Kathleen said, we would learn, we would have those images, but we had to do the kind of organizing and organize the kind of revolutionary struggle that worked for us and worked for our situation. And that we would learn by practice. There was this big thing that we said that theory is based upon practice. So you would get into the community and see what was really going on, and that would change how you organize. And so we have to still be guided by that. Whatever we call it, ideologically, spiritually, we have to organize people around their needs, and we have to organize around these crises that are attacking the communities, mass incarceration, the health crisis. The other thing that has to be talked about, I'll mention it briefly, I know I'm talking a lot, but the AIDS, HIV epidemic that specifically is and most devastatingly affecting young women now, young heterosexual women. That's become the target. That's become what we have to organize around. And of course, within that group, young women of color for all of those kind of reasons. So we have to be just working on all of those fronts. Whatever we call it, it's got to be about the work, and it has to be about organization on those three levels: policy, community, and grassroots programs.
Yes. Judith. Sorry.
How you doing? Thank you for everything. I've been very inspired. I'm Reggie Workman, and I'm here to enjoy what you're doing. But it's very important to me that all of us who are doing this and have been doing these things for many years have an idea of setting up a cadre of people who we're going to lateral the ball to as we grow older. Who's going to take over what we are doing and make sure that the flame doesn't go out? And why and how can we have more contact with the people who are dealing with Occupy? Because those kids are in the street. Many of them don't know you and all that we have done, and there's no communication. The dots are not connected. I'm very concerned about that.
Good comment.
Yeah, that's a great comment. They're connecting. I've met a lot of the young people that are involved in Occupy, and they're very smart. One of the brilliance of what they're doing is that the media keeps saying that there's no leadership. And if you come down and you see when they gather in coffee houses and when they gather afterwards, when they're sitting around in their circles with their computers, figuring out how to communicate and what the next move is going to be, it's very strategic, it's very thought out, and they're communicating, they're getting those messages out. The thing we're trying to do is get more and more folks to come to the community to see those community programs. And I agree 100% with what you said, Brother Workman, about organizing the young people. And Kathleen and Sonia know my work for the last 25 years has been with young people through programs like City Kids and Impact Repertory Theater, where at least 1,000 young people have come through the program. We use creative arts as the hook, you see, but when we get them in, we start talking about social justice and history and community organizing so that they can go out and be ripples in a pond. That's been the center of my work. In the beginning, to the dismay of people that wanted me to do some other things, probably around prison and around certain other things they were doing, but I knew that that's the work that we had to do. Where are those cadres, those youth cadres? As one friend of mine who's 80 years old now, he says, my job has to be about training my replacements. And that's what he's always done, is kind of pass that on. And by the way, he became a friend in prison, not because he was a fellow prisoner, but he was a prison guard who used to smuggle in books. Could have lost his job. His name is Brother Arno, A-R-N-O. I write about him in the book. And he would smuggle in books. And 40 years later, he's still doing the same things. He has the greatest private black book collection outside the Schomburg Library. We have to be about training our replacements.
Wow. Anybody else?
Hi, thank you so much for thank you for giving the talk today. I really appreciate it. My name is Nicole Hannah Jones, and I have a more kind of personal question. I took my first Black Studies class in high school, and it was the first time I felt fully human as a Black woman in America, because it was the first time I understood my place in the world and had a true sense of myself. And I ended up double majoring in Black Studies and history in undergrad, and was completely radicalized by what I was learning, because it was like the wool had been taken over from my eyes. I mean, all these things about our history that we never learned in the entire K-12 educational system. So I would, part of leading the walkouts and, really pressuring the administration and not caring about the consequences. And then you find yourself through the years, you become a part of those very institutions that you were challenging, and you still have the same kind of radical thoughts. You still see the world very clearly, but you find now that you feel, at least I feel, more and more co-opted the older I get. And I just wonder, I look at you guys, well, because you're no longer challenging the institutions in the same way.
But you've got to. You're in a university, and the very, very point of being in that university is that you challenge it. When we came in to begin Black Studies, the thing that only certain people went to school, we pushed for open enrollment. And all of a sudden, people came in who had never been in colleges before. And then we said simply, okay, some of them might not be ready for college. So then we got programs so we would have them in early enrollment in August, to help them. But you're there with students, and in a classroom, whatever you teach, you've got to always be seditious about it, You've always got to show the other way. And I've trained people, my sister, who said to me finally, oh, well, Sonia, you don't know how hard it is now to teach, because, they have students who come in and report on you, and then you have people sitting there reporting on you, and then I want tenure. And I said, well, yeah, true, everyone does eventually want tenure. I said, but I remember, traveling from city to city to city because I wouldn't change how I taught. I remember that. I remember my father who said, girl, if you would just teach and don't say anything about anything, you'll be okay. And I'm not saying that to you, to say that but the point is that that's why we have trained people to say simply, you're in there, and at some point you've got to teach what is really going on in the world. And the point is not to give a name to it, though. Someone said to me, well, and when I've been checking out what you're teaching, and isn't that, and I said, I don't know. I don't know what it's called. You can call it whatever. I don't give any name to what I teach, because once you name it at some point, then you could be in trouble. But the point is that you're there, though, for students, black, white, green, purple, blue, whatever. You're there to make sure that they get a good deal. I was sitting in my office one day, and, grading papers, you're always grading papers. Kathleen was talking about traveling with her papers. You're always grading papers. And a student came in with tears in her eyes, and I said, what's the deal? She said, well, Black women quite often always wear a kerchief on their head, right? She said, my teacher looked at me and said, why do you people always wear those rags on your head? So I said, I put my pen down and said, well, so what did you say? She said, I didn't say anything because, if you say something, you'll get an F. I said, I guarantee you, because you didn't say anything, you will get an F, right? She said, well, there's nothing to do. So I said, come, tell me where he is, whatever. Let's walk over to his office. So I'd been in my bookshelf and pulled off a book of poetry, Martin Carter, that great poet from Guyana. And, we walked over and I knocked on the professor's door and I said, hi, can we come in? I said, this student is a student of yours, and she related to me that, you looked up and said, why you people always have these rags on your head? And I had a kerchief on my head. I said, they're not rags, they're kerchiefs. They're scarves, whatever. And I said, and I just want to say to you in as gentle a way as I can say it, if you ever say something like that to anybody in a classroom, I will call a press conference here in North Philadelphia and talk about the racism that goes on in universities. He said, oh, Professor Sanchez, I didn't mean anything by it. I said, let me read you a poem from a man by the name of Martin Carter, who said, your hair in my hand is a rag of wonder. Martin Carter, beautiful poet, who was in prison also in Guyana. I said, I'm saying to you, my dear brother, you have no right. And I called him brother, and he popped his head back. But I call everybody brother and sister, because we are brother and sister, in spite of what we think we know, in spite of our culture. I said, let's have lunch, together sometimes in the, what do they call it? The place where all the professors go to eat high cost and lousy food, whatever. Because I like just to give you some books, and talk about this, I said, because the point is that you don't tell people what they wear in a classroom, and how they look in a classroom. And I like to give you my number, because a lot of my former students who are teaching call me and they cry. And I listen to that. I say, I know it's tough, but you still have got to understand that I had to go in and listen to a young professor teach what they call slave narratives, but they're really freedom narratives, okay? That's a different terminology, so it's a different way of looking at it. And when she got to the part, she would never say anything about the white enslavers. And so I'm listening to her, and then I go and I said, well, this is difficult. I mean, you're talking about people being enslaved, right? You've got to say something about what they're doing. She said, I don't want to offend the white students. I said, no. You don't teach from the point of offending anyone. You teach what that book is saying, what the literature is saying at that particular point. And so I said, my dear sister, I need for you to reteach this for the students who walked out of their heads kind of crazy. I know it's tough. Teaching this stuff, this is in the 21st century. We don't have support anymore. When something goes on, people would gather and come in, whatever. But the support that I think we have to have inner is that that you are then teaching things that people coming before. I mean, when I found out Ida B. Wells existed, I wrote it right into my syllabus, right, and walked in, began to teach her. I mean, it's that what I'm saying at that point, but also recognition that you can't do everything in the university. And so one of the things that you do is outside the university, and you take your students outside. So when Black History Month came, I would make it part of, they had to go and teach in high schools, especially the men, because there's so few men in these high schools, now, whatever. And so we went in, and they had to teach Black history, what they learned in the high schools. When Women's History Month came, then we had to go in and teach for Women's, History Month also, too. And when poetry came in, whatever. So for 3 months, they went into high schools. I mean, the point of Black studies at the very beginning was community, the part of the community. When you took my writing class at San Francisco State, you had to go out and help Joe Gonzalez put out Journal of Black Poetry. I mean, you had to learn how to type on that, what's that thing? Not the computer. Mimeograph. Our hands were forever purple, whatever, And so they had to go, and then after they did it, they had to learn how to proofread, and then they had to go out and sell it. Come on. All parts of it. I'm teaching you something, but you also got to understand, you got to support a magazine that is coming out that is also teaching what we're teaching. That's what we did. So I know, but I'll give you my telephone number. Give me a shout out. If you ever need to just scream, or I'll come and sit and teach a class for you. I don't know what you teach, whatever, but just, you can say she's the crazy one, whatever, et cetera. I'm not, and my number is 215-843-7017. Don't call me for crazy stuff, okay? But just call me when you feel like you're crazy, going crazy,
I think she needs it one more time.
Yeah.
She's ready.
215-843-7017.
We have about 5 minutes, I'm told.
Hi, I'm Stephanie. So thank you so much. It's such a joy to hear you, and I agree with you that you feel filled with courage and conviction listening to you guys, and it's really inspiring. So in all the joy I had working with Jamal, there were two big myths, I guess, that were debunked for me about the Black Panther. One was, of course, the image, the myth, the cliche is that, of course, of this very macho, violent organization. And one of the biggest things that I get from the talk today is the transformative power of literature. And for that, I'm so thankful to you guys for reiterating and repeating it out and clear. Another thing, and there's a very funny passage about this in Jamal's book. It's about respect for women. Again, we have this image of this very macho. I mean, he puts it so much better than I do. But, this very macho culture. And here we see with the two of you professors, but in reading the book, how important women were, respect to women. And I guess, since I'm talking about two myths or cliches that were debunked about the Black Panthers, and we're so lucky to have the three of you, are there, as parting words, any other cliche or things that you've heard over the years about the Panthers that have really, really hitched and irritated you that you would like to share with us for legacy?
Yeah, they said that we were violent. That was the big one. We were violent. Lord have mercy. I asked students, have they ever seen a picture of, because in New England this works, a picture of the Minuteman. And the Minuteman was the, soldier, U.S. military, not even U.S., against the British. And I said, well, what does the Minuteman wear? And they said, oh, he wears a hat, he wears a vest, he has pants, he's holding a rifle. So then I said, well, have you ever seen a picture of Huey Newton? And what is he like? Well, he has a hat, he's got a leather jacket, and he's holding a weapon. I said, well, have you ever heard the Minutemen called violent? Oh, no, they're patriotic, they're heroes, they're this. Well, and then the Panthers are called nothing but violent. So what I was going to say is it's really about what's legitimate. We've been delegitimized trying to defend our communities against violence. And really, the violence to which African Americans, Africans, Negroes, whatever, all these different names we've been called, the violence that we've been subjected to, that makes what the British did to the Americans look like a picnic. So therefore, this understanding of what is violence is a form of resistance to violence, and that's what we've been attacked for. We want to be violent. We want to allow violence to be used to dominate, and if you resist, then you're violent. So that type of thinking is, what we were deconstructing, and we're still deconstructing.